Well, good morning. It's good to see everyone here today. We appreciate your coming to assemble with us to worship and study from the scriptures. What I want to do today as we open the Bibles, I want to continue with some of our studies from the book of Daniel. And you're probably not surprised that I'm studying from the book of Daniel, since first of all, I need to do a commercial plug for Sunday evening, 5:30. We've been studying the last several weeks at 5:30 on Sunday from the book of Daniel. I'm convinced that this book is very pertinent to our time that we're living in today, because it's set in a time of turmoil and distress for God's people. And we certainly are living in that. The whole purpose of the book of Daniel, I'm convinced, is to build faith and stability in the children of God, those who are trying to follow God, and confidence that God is there with them, even in the face of very dire circumstances or physical things that are going on around them. And so from that perspective, I think it's very pertinent to our lives. We're in chapters 7 and 8 in the book of Daniel in our study on Sunday evening. So that's where we'll be studying tonight. However, this morning I want to go back to chapter 3, to what I consider one of the greatest expressions of faith and trust in God in the entire Bible. We have the situation there in chapter 3. We have three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are Hebrews or Jewish young men who have been carried in captivity to Babylon. In captivity to Babylon, they are under a very arrogant, self-serving, impetuous, and a king that can be angered with the slightest offense, Nebuchadnezzar. He has in chapter 3, he has built this great monument with a statue on top that he's talks about representing God. I think we see from the context, it represents his concept of idolatry, of an idolatrous God, but also it represents his concept of allegiance to him as the ruler. And here I've got to turn something off here. Okay, sorry for that interruption. Anyway, he has built a statue which stands for, in essence, stands for his power over the people. And he wants people to worship this statue, which becomes a form of saying, yes, we are subject to you. And that he puts it, since it is a statue that has the concept of being a supreme being, and puts Nebuchadnezzar in a position of being a supreme being. We have these three young Jewish individuals who cannot recognize anyone as being supreme except Jehovah God. And that's the setting we're going to pick up with Daniel, the 3rd chapter, and we're going to begin reading in verse 13 as Nebuchadnezzar finds out that these three Jewish men will not bow down to his statue. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready at the moment that you hear the sound of and he lists all these instruments here, sort of like when you hear the orchestra start playing, are you ready to fall down and worship the image that I have made? Very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace of the blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" There's two things I want us to notice initially as we look at that. In verse 14, he says, "The golden image that I have set up," indicating Nebuchadnezzar's pride in himself, his demand for allegiance to him. I have done this So you need to bow down to it. And in verse 15, to show that he considers himself above Jehovah God, he asks this question: what God is there that is able to deliver you out of my hands? There is no God, there's no being that is capable of saving you once I've made a decision. So he has elevated himself. And this is very much like the passage we were studying in 1 Timothy in Adam's class this morning. Nebuchadnezzar is blaspheming God because he's putting himself up above God or next to God and saying God is no greater than I am. So it's a very similar situation that Paul was mentioning there in 1 Timothy. Now we're going to see the response of these three young men in beginning in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of the blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." These three young men here make a statement of faith that I think is, to me, that is a place with their faith that we need to be in our faith. They have such confidence in Jehovah God, and I'm going to examine that just a little bit this morning. A couple of things I think are really significant in this is the idea that we do not need to negotiate this. Nebuchadnezzar, you've come in and we've refused to worship your statue. You came in with this great proposal that if we would worship your statue, we're going to get this result. We're going to be relieved of this death in the fire. They say, Nebuchadnezzar, there's no sense in bringing a proposal. We don't need to negotiate this. We don't need to talk about this. We're going to serve God. We're not going to serve your statue. And we see that response is we're going to see down in verse 19. It fills the king with rage that they would have no regard for his proposal, but they would stay with God. Now, they make a choice here, but I want to suggest, and one of the things I want us to evaluate in our lesson this morning, they don't make an arbitrary choice. It's not just a choice that they make. They make an informed decision, a decision based upon what they know about God and know about who he is and their service to him. And so being in that position, they do not even give any credibility to Nebuchadnezzar's statue. And so we don't need to discuss that as their thought. And I think that the reason why their response is that way is in verse 17 and 18 of this reading here. He says, "Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace." You say you're going to put us in the furnace, but we serve a God that can take us out of the furnace or deliver us from the furnace. They understood that God's power superseded all power that Nebuchadnezzar may have. He might have the power to put them in the furnace, but God has the power to deliver them from the furnace. And I think they understood that God was greater than Nebuchadnezzar. Seems to be the fundamental thing that affected their decision. But they also understood something else that I think is really important for us because, and I think this applies to us as we oftentimes when we get in a distressful situation and we go to God and we pray to God and we want deliverance very bad from that distressful situation. Now, there's nothing wrong with praying for deliverance, but God is not always going to deliver us from our distresses in this life. None of us are going to leave this life alive. some distressful situation is going to remove us from this life. These young men did not know at the time they told Nebuchadnezzar that they were not going to bow down to his statue in order to be delivered from the furnace. They didn't know what the outcome was going to be, because verse 18 very clearly says, but if he does not, if God chooses to not deliver us from the furnace, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They had faith in God, who he is, and in his abilities. And that faith was not dependent upon the present outcome of the situation. I think that's significant for us as individuals. Many times we measure or we consider our faith in God and our willingness to continue to serve God based on the present outcome of our distresses. We pray to God that he will deliver us from this particular problem. He will heal us in this particular circumstance, and that healing does not come. So we blame God because he did not heal us. We did not get that in it. We doubt that he is able or that he cares. These young men understood that God's deliverance of them was going to be God's choice, and that in this life, God does not owe us delivery from all the distresses that we're going to encounter in this life. He can deliver us from distresses, but he does not guarantee us or owe us deliver from all of our distresses. That's why sometimes we see people who are very devout, they pray and they don't get delivery from their disease or the distress, because that is a part of life, and God has not guaranteed us that he will deliver us, or he does not owe us delivery from those distresses. So the idea, I think, here is why this is such a great statement of faith. Their trust is in God, not in what's going to happen in this life. They may be burned in the furnace, or they may not be burned in the furnace. Now, when we read this story, we always like to jump to the end of the story, right? Because there at the end of the story, they are delivered, and God does deliver them from the furnace. But that's not the foundation of their faith. That is a blessing or a grace that God extended to them. Their faith is based on who he is, who God is, and he was able to, what he's able to do for them. This is very similar to what Job says in Job 13 and verse 15. Job in his distresses and has been struggling with why he has experienced all the unbelievable misery that he has experienced. But a statement of faith by Job is, though he slay me, I will hope in him. He is not going to give up on God because of his distresses. And did Job suffer any distresses? I can't imagine anybody that's ever lived that suffered more pain and more distress than Job did, yet his faith was still in God, no matter what his present circumstance was. That's the kind of faith that these young men expressed in God at the time that they were about to go into the fiery furnace. And I think that's the kind of faith that God is looking for from all of us. It's a response based upon who God is and not what we're going to experience in life. Now, my question is, how can we have that kind of faith? That's the kind of faith that we need to have as individuals. This is the kind of faith that I suggest to you. It's not just that they woke up one morning and said, oh, we're going to believe God, and we're just not going to worship that statue. Their faith is one that is based upon an informed response, knowing who God is and what he is. I'm going to turn and look at a couple of passages from the Psalms now. And I think it's very important that our faith be based on who God is and not what is going to happen to us or what happens to us in this life. In Psalms 90 and in verse 2, it says, before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. This concept of someone being God, in this Psalm 90 and verse 2, we have the idea that he is creator, he is eternal, and he is above all. I think that's really important that we understand God in that light, that he is eternal, he's creator, and he's above all. If we can truly understand that's who he is, there is nobody or anything in this life that will compare to him. So if he makes a promise, he makes a statement, then we can trust that above all else. And I believe that's where these three young men were here. Because of their origin and their study as young Hebrew men, they had seen who God was through the study of the Old Testament and through their experience in life, that God was indeed over all, and therefore they had a faith and trust in him. I think they're very unique in some ways in their era. These three young men were of the royal family of Judah. And they had come out of Jerusalem, where the king was burning the pages of the prophet's writings. Their cousins were in power in Jerusalem, and they were burning the pages of prophecy because they didn't want to listen to them. Well, these three young men had looked at the evidence, had considered the evidence for God and God's teaching, and had a faith or a trust in him that their fellow cousins or brethren in the royal family had rejected and turned away from. So I think it's very important for us to see that they recognized who God was, the eternal creator with all power. The second passage I want us to consider is in Acts 17 and verse 28, as Paul is standing before a group of Greek philosophers in Athens. And he makes his statement there about the God. Let me turn over and read Acts 17 in verse 28. As he is appealing to these people to have faith or to believe in God, he makes that appeal based upon who God is. He says, for in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets said, for we are also are his children. Why does Paul have faith in God? And why was he trying to get the Athenians to have faith in God? Because in him we live and move and exist. We exist because of him. And so therefore we should have faith in him. Being then therefore the children of God, we also not to think of the divine nature as gold or silver or stone, or an image formed by the art and thought of man. We don't need to equate God with our thinking or our accomplishments or the things that exist in our life. We see that God is the origin and he's not the product, is what I think Paul is saying here. They're idol gods, this idol that Nebuchadnezzar made. These were products of man's thinking and man's hand, whereas man is the product. God is the origin, and man is the product of God, and not God, the product of man. Also, I want us to see from Romans, the 11th chapter, in verse 33 through 36, a statement that Paul makes to the Romans about God. Romans 11, beginning in verse 33, he says, oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, unfathomable his way. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has become his counselor, or who has first given to him that which that it might be paid back to him and again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. So we see Paul stating that idea that which one of you can give God something, that God will have something to give back to you. Well, we know it works the other way around. God's the supplier of everything, wisdom, knowledge, and even the physical things we have, so that we can in turn offer something back in service to God. And so the very nature of the being of God is we must understand that he is the almighty, eternal creator. And because of that, he is able and he is worthy of our service. One of the passages I want to read from the book of Psalms, and this is kind of a long reading. I want to read the entire 33rd chapter of the book of Psalms. So if you would, turn over and with me in this passage. This passage in the book of Psalms, these three young men would have had access to this passage at the time that they lived, because Psalms were accumulated in the days of David, and they're living several hundred years after David. So they would have had access to this to build their faith in God. Two or three things I want us to observe as we're looking through Psalms 33. One is the almighty nature of God, but also the gracious and loving nature of God. It says, sing for joy to the Lord, O you righteous one. Praise is becoming to the upright. Give thanks to the Lord with the lyre. Sing praise to him with a harp of 10 string. Sing to him a new song. Play skillfully with a shout of joy. For the word of the Lord is upright, and all his word is done in faithfulness. Or all his work is done in faithfulness. He loves righteousness and justice, and the earth is full of loving kindness of the Lord. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, by the breath of his mouth all their host. He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the deeps in the storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. The Lord nullifies the counsel of the nations, frustrates the plans of the people. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart from generation to generation. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen for his own inheritance. The Lord looks from heaven. He sees all the sons of men. From his dwelling place he looks out, and all the inhabitants of the earth. He who fashions the hearts of them all, and who understands all their works. The king is not saved by a mighty army, and a warrior is not delivered by great strength. A horse is a false hope of victory, nor does it deliver anyone by its great strength. Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope for his loving kindness, to deliver their soul from death, to keep them alive in famine. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. For our heart rejoices in him, because we trust in his holy name. Let your loving kindness, O Lord, be upon us, accordingly as we have hoped in you. These three young men had hoped in the Lord. They trusted in the Lord, and they did not allow anything to sway them from their hope. Now, I want to contrast these three young men with Nebuchadnezzar for just a moment. As Nebuchadnezzar sees these young men will not worship his idol, the passage says he got furious because Nebuchadnezzar sees himself as the one in charge, and he is rejected by that. He does not see God as the one in charge. And Nebuchadnezzar are much like us as people today. Nebuchadnezzar was very arrogant and saw himself, because he had conquered the region or the world of his day, that nobody was superior or above him. And whatever he wanted to do was his choice. He can make that choice. And I submit to you that that's the way that we often live in our world today. We see our people as free people, ourselves as free people, with the right of choice. And how many political discussions or arguments did we see in the news or reading the paper about it's all about my choice? We see ourselves as being independent, free people that can choose whatever we want. And that's why he says in Deuteronomy, or not in, but in Daniel 3 and verse 15, what God is there who can deliver you out of my hand? We basically say, who can tell me what to do? Because I'm a free agent, I can do what I want to do. I can make the choice I want. And as long as we have that attitude or that perspective, we're not going to have faith in God, one that is greater than us, or one that is over us. Nebuchadnezzar foolishly made a bad choice because he did not understand his relationship to God. He did not understand that God was greater than him. Now, I want us to contrast that with Daniel 4 and verse 37. This is the same Nebuchadnezzar that's going to make a statement in Daniel 4 and verse 37, which is quite different than the one he made in Daniel 3. The last verse of the chapter 4, he says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true and his ways just. He is able to humble those who walk in pride. In Daniel 3, Nebuchadnezzar was the epitome of pride when he made his decree. In Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar is one who has humbled himself and recognizes the greatness of Jehovah. Well, what happened between the last of Daniel 3 and the end of Daniel 4? Nebuchadnezzar had to eat grass for 7 seasons. And that's what he's saying here. God can humble the proud. We've got to be humble before God. We've got to quit thinking of ourselves as being the end all to everything. We've got to see that God is the one who is in charge, and we've got to humble ourselves before God. And until we humble ourselves, we will not ever to be able to have faith in God, because we will never recognize who he is. Again, remember, our faith has to be in who God is and not what he provides for us, but who he is. Unless we humble ourselves, we will never be able to recognize who God is. I want to turn over to Job, and this time we're going to turn to Job 38. And this is a question that, of course, Job, as I've already mentioned, he suffered many things. But Job began to question God, or why God would allow him to suffer these things. And in Job 38, verse 1 through 4, God is going to speak to Job in response to Job's questioning God. It says, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I'll ask you and you instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. The reason that we don't trust God is because of what Job was questioning God here. We don't have understanding. We don't truly know who he is. We have not examined who he is, and therefore we do not make the informed response of this great level of faith that these 3 young men had. So I think the first challenge that for us is we need to become informed truly and see the evidence for who God is. And I wanted to make just in closing out our lesson this morning, I have 2 sets of suggestions I want to make about how we can be informed about who God is and then how we can make a informed response, which will be a faith that is not based upon a selfish choice. And I think that's, sometimes we want God to be who he is because we want what we want. We want to serve God because of who he is. And in order for us to do that, we must know who he is. I want to turn to a passage in Romans, the first chapter now. And this is going to be the basis for my first suggestion on how we can serve God from an informed knowledge of who he is. In Romans 1, beginning in verse 18, I'm going to be reading down through verse 22. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through that which has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools." I think this is a picture of Nebuchadnezzar. This is a picture of us. When we do not seek to understand and know God, we become wise in our own minds and we become foolish. But as there's a couple of things in this section I want us to focus on. In verse 19, he says, "Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through that which has been made, so they're without excuse." The writer of Romans here says we are without excuse if we don't believe in an eternal, loving, all-powerful God, because we've closed our eyes to his creation. The first thing for us to understand is God's creation, and everything we see out here in that creation is evidence of a creator and a supreme being. Now, we live in a society that wants to cloud that, right? We live in a society that doesn't want to acknowledge a creator or a supreme being. And so they come up with all kinds of smoke to cloud the idea that there is a supreme being, that there is a creator. Well, my suggestion to you and to me, let's look at the evidence that God says it is there. He says the creation is the evidence that he is an eternal being, that he is God. And so some of the things I would suggest to you and things that we could investigate would be evidence, would be the design and intricate nature and interrelationship of everything that is there. Let's go get some scientific information, go to a scientist that truly believes in God. And there's plenty of data out there, information out there that will show us evidence that these things are not accidental, but they are things that are created. The existence of life itself, man has never been able to duplicate or explain how life exists. Yet that's an evidence for God. Another thing I think is significant in identifying God that man can't explain is the ability to reason, the ability to think and to reason. And I've recently, of course, all of you know that Ernestine has recently been diagnosed with cancer, and we've been going to the MD Anderson Institute in Texas for some treatment. And I was recently reading an article about one of the scientists there, a fellow named James Allison. And in 2018, he won the Nobel Prize in medicine because he did research and figured out how the cells can interact with the cancer cells to try and to defeat the cancer cells within the body. Now, that's not something that came about by accident. that's not something that came out by evolution. That came out because a group of scientists sat down with reason and intelligence and evaluated the design that was there in the body, in the cell, and how these cells interacted with other cells. That's evidence that God has given us as people the ability to reason and to think through and to learn things about this universe He's given us. I think that's very much in line with what God told Adam back when he was created in the beginning, and He set man there. He told him to rule over the earth. A part of that ruling over the earth is to managing the elements and the things of the earth for the benefit of man. And certainly this cancer research has great potential for benefit of people. We couldn't have that without the ability for people to think and to reason. And so I think those things are great evidence that there is a God. We need to sit down and research that and let that build our confidence in God. Now, I think that's external. That's evidence from looking at the creation itself. It's legitimate because the book of Romans says we should be able to do that, and that's identifying God. But the second thing I think is significant for us is what God says Himself about Himself. And of course, that's what He reveals to us in His Word. And that's what we're able to see about God from the Bible. And I want to just mention something cautious about, or a caution I would have on the way we look at the Bible. Sometimes we look at the Bible as a book of laws or a rule book. And if we look at the Bible as a book of laws or rule book, we know that laws are always negotiable, right? Because we have a Senate that meets every year to make new laws or change the laws we have. So we begin to think of the concept that laws are negotiable. And so when we go to the Bible and read something there, we say, well, that fit their time or their place. Well, I submit to you, that's not the way that we should look at the Bible. We need to look at the Bible as God revealing Himself to us. God showing us who He is. In Genesis 1 and verse 1, the most prevalent phrase in the first chapter is that God said, and it happened. It all focuses upon who God is and His ability, His power to make things happen because of who He is. In Hebrews 1 and verse 1 to 3 talks about in the old times, God spoke through the prophets, and now He speaks through His Son. See, the idea that it is God speaking to us, first through the prophets and now through His Son. It's not He delivered a rule book for us to go by, but God is speaking to us. He's telling us about Himself and His nature. In Matthew 5 and in the whole Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most repeated statement is, you have heard, but I say unto you. Of course, we know Jesus is God, and that He is revealing Himself. He's revealing the nature of God to us. So when we go to the Bible, we see that that is God being revealed to us. And when we see that God, that's the God we can have confidence in. Both the God who created the things we see in the world and the God who is revealed to us in the Scriptures. It's only when we build that understanding of who God is and our faith is in God. It's not in the written word, but it's in the God that the written word shows us. I'm not trying to diminish our confidence in the word, but we need to see that it is God that we're being shown by this word. And when we understand that God, our faith will be in Him. And so I think this will help us with our determination when stress comes. When the challenge to our faith comes, is it going to be there? We often talk about our young people, how they need to study evidences classes. I think all of us old people need to study evidences classes, both external to the scriptures of what God has created and internal to the scriptures of what God has said. That's where faith comes from, not because I woke up one morning with a problem and said, God, I'm going to trust you now. It's because we know who God is and we have confidence in who he is, and we must learn who he is. It's not an arbitrary decision. It's an informed response to an eternal loving God. That's what faith is. And that's what we need to have within ourselves. This morning, if you have, through your study of the scriptures, your study of looking at life around you, recognize that there is an eternal God and you want to be subject to him, you can become his servant through baptism into Jesus Christ, becoming a follower of Christ. We invite you now with this song we stand to sing.